Hello everyone and welcome back to Trail of Secret. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story number 1. I was at the grocery store picking up a few things for dinner after a long day. The store was quiet, with only a handful of people moving through the aisles. It was late. Close to 9 in the evening, and I had deliberately chosen this time because the store was usually less crowded. After gathering my items, I made my way to the checkout counter, tired but glad to be heading home soon. The cashier, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, gave me a polite nod as he started scanning my groceries. I watched him work, placing my items in bags with an efficiency that came from experience. The beeping of the scanner was the only sound between us, and I barely noticed when he paused for a moment, glancing up at me with an unreadable expression. I assumed he was distracted or perhaps just tired, much like I was. He continued scanning the rest of my items without a word, and I pulled out my wallet ready to pay. It was an ordinary, uneventful transaction until he handed me my receipt. His hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary as he passed the receipt to me, and then he leaned slightly forward. His voice was barely above a whisper, but I heard him clearly. "Be careful," he said, his tone laced with an urgency that sent a chill down my spine. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What?" I asked, my voice coming out more startled than I intended. He didn't respond right away, only meeting my eyes for a brief second before looking away. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed the interaction, but no one seemed to be paying attention. The store was quiet, and the other cashiers were busy with their own customers. "What do you mean?" I asked again, my voice quieter, this time, almost hesitant. He shook his head slightly, avoiding my gaze as he began scanning the next customer's items. It was as if the moment had passed and he didn't want to elaborate. I felt a surge of unease as I picked up my bags and moved toward the exit. His words played in my mind. Outside, the parking lot was dimly lit and a light drizzle had begun to fall. I walked briskly to my car, glancing over my shoulder more than once. The words "be careful" echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was he warning me about something specific? Did he know something I didn't? Or was it just a harmless comment, perhaps even a misunderstanding? The possibilities swirled in my mind as I unlocked my car and got inside, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the receipt in my hand. I turned it over, half expecting to find a note or some kind of clue scribbled on it, but there was nothing unusual. It was just a standard receipt with the list of items I had purchased and the total at the bottom. I felt foolish for letting it bother me so much, but there was something about the way he had said it, the urgency in his voice, that made it impossible to ignore. The drive home was uneventful, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. Every car that passed me on the road seemed to linger a moment too long, and every shadow along the sidewalk seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Home was my safe place, and I was eager to put the strange encounter behind me. I carried my groceries inside, locking the door behind me and double-checking that all the windows were secure. As I unpacked the bags, I couldn't help but glance out the window every few minutes, my mind still racing with possibilities. I told myself that I was overreacting, that the cashier's words were probably nothing more than a strange choice of phrase. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something more. I finished putting everything away and settled into my usual evening routine, trying to distract myself with television and the comfort of my familiar surroundings. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I debated whether I should go back to the store and ask the cashier what he meant, but the idea felt absurd. What would I say? That his words had unsettled me to the point of obsession? I knew I would sound ridiculous, and there was no guarantee he would even be working that day. Instead, I decided to let it go, convincing myself that it was nothing to worry about. But as the day went on, small things began to unnerve me. I noticed a car parked across the street from my house, one I hadn't seen before. It was an old beat-up sedan, and it didn't seem to belong to any of my neighbors. First I dismissed it, assuming it was someone visiting or perhaps just a coincidence. But as the hours passed, the car remained, and I started to feel uneasy. I tried to focus on other things, but my attention kept drifting back to the window, where the car sat like an ominous presence. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard a strange noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps on gravel, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I went to the window and peered out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The car was still there, though its silhouette was barely visible under the dim streetlights. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that the cashier's words had planted a seed of paranoia in my mind, but the feeling of unease was impossible to ignore. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, and I found myself listening intently for any signs of something out of the ordinary. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with unsettling images, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight, whispers that I couldn't quite make out, and the cashier's voice repeating those two words, "Be careful." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. The shadows in my room seemed darker than usual, and the silence felt heavier, like something was watching me. Then, just as I was about to shake off the feeling and lie back down, I heard it, a soft tapping at my bedroom window. I sat up in bed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was dark, but I could still feel the weight of that dream pressing down on me. The sound of the cashier's voice whispering, "Be careful," lingered in my ears. I glanced at the clock, 3:14 a.m., tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a noise outside, a soft scrape, then silence. I froze, my body stiff with tension. It could have been anything. The wind, an animal, maybe even just my imagination. But after the events of the last 24 hours, my gut told me something was wrong. Slowly I slid out of bed, my bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. My heart pounded in my ears as I crept toward the window, my fingers trembling as I pulled back the curtain ever so slightly. The car was still there, but now the driver's side door was open. A dark figure stood beside it, barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to call someone, anyone. But what would I even say? There's a car outside my house and a person is standing there? It sounded ridiculous. But then the figure moved, a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. I sucked in a sharp breath and took a step back from the window, my mind racing. I needed to do something. Should I turn on the lights? Call the police? Before I could decide, my phone buzzed in my hand. A text message. I looked down, and my stomach dropped. Unknown number. You're awake. Good. I nearly dropped the phone. My breath hitched, and a cold chill crawled down my spine. How did they know? I looked back at the window, but the figure was gone. My chest tightened as I scanned the street, searching for any sign of movement. My fingers fumbled as I unlocked my phone and opened the message. My hands trembled as I typed back. Me. Who is this? No response. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Then, another buzz. Unknown number. Check your front door. I didn't move. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to call the police instead. But against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward the door, my steps hesitant. The house was eerily silent. The only sound was my own breathing, shallow and uneven. My fingers hesitated on the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. And what I saw sent ice through my veins. There, on my doorstep, was a single, folded piece of paper. My name was written on it, in red ink, and underneath it, in shaky, uneven handwriting, were 2 words: be careful. Story number 2. I've always loved old family stories, the kind passed down through generations, the ones that seem half true, half legend. But I never expected that one day, my own past would become a mystery I couldn't explain. It all started on a quiet Saturday afternoon. I had decided to clean out the attic of my childhood home, a task I had put off for years. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet as I sifted through dusty boxes, old books, and forgotten trinkets. The air smelled of aged paper and time itself. That's when I found it. An old Polaroid picture, yellowed at the edges, buried beneath a stack of letters. I picked it up, brushed off the dust, and froze. It was a picture of my family. My father, my mother, my younger sister, and me. I recognized the moment immediately. It was my sister's 8th birthday. The backyard was decorated with colorful banners, a chocolate cake sat on the table, and my sister wore her favorite blue dress. But there was someone else in the picture. Standing, just behind my sister, slightly out of focus, was a man I didn't recognize. His face was blurry, not in the way old photographs fade, but as if he had never been meant to be there in the first place. His posture was rigid, his head tilted slightly, and he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at my sister. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't remember this man. I flipped the picture over. There was no date, no note, just a faint smudge, as if someone had once tried to write something but then wiped it away. I sat there for a long time staring at the photograph. Had I forgotten about this man? Was he a family friend? A distant relative? Something inside me whispered that I was looking at something I was never supposed to see. And then, something even stranger happened. I heard footsteps. Not from the attic, but from downstairs. I wasn't alone. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I held my breath. The attic was silent except for the rhythmic pounding of my heart. I strained to listen, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. Then, the floorboards creaked again. Someone was downstairs. I put the photograph down carefully, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone, but when I tapped the screen, my stomach dropped. No signal. The house was old, surrounded by thick trees on the outskirts of town, and the reception had always been poor, but this felt like more than just a bad connection. I slowly made my way to the attic door, my bare feet making no noise on the wooden floor. The door was slightly ajar. I had left it that way, but now it felt like an invitation, an open pathway leading me into something I wasn't prepared for. I peeked through the gap. The hallway below was dim, the only light coming from a window at the far end. The late afternoon sun cast long, eerie shadows across the floor. Then I saw movement. A dark figure slipped out of sight at the bottom of the stairs. My breath hitched. Someone was in the house. I swallowed my fear and stepped onto the staircase as quietly as I could, each creak of the old wood making my pulse jump. My mind raced. Who could it be? A burglar? A squatter? Someone who had been hiding here all along? As I reached the bottom step, the air felt different, thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I hesitated, then turned the corner into the living room. It was empty. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, untouched since my parents had moved out years ago. The silence pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. Then I saw it, the photograph. Not the one I had found in the attic, but a different copy, placed neatly on the fireplace mantel. It was the same picture. My family, my sister, and the stranger. But this one was different. The man's face was no longer blurry, and he was smiling. Part 3. The search for answers. Panic clawed at my throat. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move, grabbing the photograph and scanning every detail. I had never seen this copy before. It wasn't in the attic, and I knew for certain it hadn't been in the house when I arrived. someone had left it here, and that someone had been in my home. I whirled around, expecting to see a shadow lurking in the doorway, but the house was empty. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. My hands shook as I backed toward the door, my mind racing for answers. Who was this man? And why was his face suddenly clear in this version of the picture? I needed answers. I grabbed my car keys and the photograph and rushed outside, locking the door behind me. My parents' house was isolated, surrounded by overgrown trees and a long, empty driveway. I glanced around, searching for signs of movement. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I got in the car and drove straight to my mother's house, my pulse refusing to slow. She was the only person who might have answers. My mother lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, her small house neatly tucked between rows of identical homes. She was surprised to see me. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" she asked, concern etched across her face. I didn't waste time. I pulled out the photograph and placed it on the table. "Who is this man?" I demanded. The moment my mother's eyes landed on the picture, the color drained from her face. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "Mom," I pressed. "Who is he?" She swallowed hard, setting the picture down carefully as if it might shatter. "You weren't supposed to see this," she whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "Why? Who is he?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window as if she expected someone to be standing outside. "His name was Daniel," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And he's been dead for 30 years. My mind struggled to process her words. "Dead?" I echoed. "But that doesn't make sense. He's in the picture. He was at my sister's birthday party. I don't remember him, but he was there." My mother's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "That's because we erased him," she said, her voice thick with something I couldn't quite identify. "Or at least we tried." I stared at her, waiting for an explanation. "Daniel was a family friend," she admitted. "He was close to us. Too close. He became obsessed with your sister." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "What do you mean, obsessed?" My mother exhaled shakily. "He would watch her, follow her. We didn't realize how bad it was until that night, her 8th birthday. He showed up uninvited, just standing there in the background watching her. Your father told him to leave." She paused. "And then, 2 days later, he was found dead in his house. He had..." She hesitated, swallowing hard. "He had hanged himself. The police ruled it a suicide." My skin prickled. "But why is he in the picture?" I asked. "Why did I find another version of it in the house today?" My mother shook her head, her eyes filling with something close to fear. "I don't know," she admitted. "After he died, strange things started happening. The picture kept showing up. We burned it, tore it apart, threw it away, but it always came back. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears." "What happened to my sister?" I asked. My mother hesitated, then whispered. "She started seeing him." The words sent a chill through me. "Seeing him?" My mother nodded slowly. "She would wake up crying, saying he was standing in her room at night watching her. We thought it was nightmares, but then..." She trailed off, her face pale. "Then what?" I pressed. "Then one night she went missing." The air in the room felt heavier. "We found her in the woods behind the house," my mother continued, her voice barely audible. "She was standing in the dark, barefoot, staring at nothing. She didn't remember how she got there, and after that, she stopped talking about him." A lump formed in my throat. "And the pictures?" I asked. "They stopped appearing. Until now," my mother murmured. A heavy silence fell between us. Then my phone buzzed. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I reached for it and glanced. At the screen, unknown number, a text message, 4 words. "Why did you forget?" I dropped the phone, and then, I saw it. In the window's reflection behind my mother, a tall, dark figure standing in the doorway, smiling. I froze. The reflection in the window was unmistakable. A tall, dark figure standing just behind my mother, smiling. I whipped around so fast that my chair nearly tipped over, but the doorway was empty. No one was there. My mother noticed my panic. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaking. I couldn't answer. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I glanced back at the window. The figure was gone, but I knew what I had seen. He was here. The phone buzzed again, still lying face up on the table. Another message. "Come back home." My blood ran cold. "Mom," I whispered. "I think he's still in the house." She didn't question me. She didn't try to rationalize it. Instead, her face turned pale, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "He never left." I didn't want to go back. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stay away, to burn that house to the ground if I had to. But I couldn't just ignore it. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over, and deep down I knew it never would be until I confronted it. By the time I reached the house, the sun had set. Shadows stretched across the driveway as I stepped out of the car, my hands gripping the photograph tightly. The house loomed ahead, silent, waiting. I hesitated at the front door, my fingers hovering over the handle. Then I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The air inside was wrong. Heavy. Cold. It smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. I stepped inside, the wooden floor groaning beneath my weight. The moment I did, the door slammed shut behind me. The lights flickered, and then I heard it. A voice. Low, distorted, whispering from the shadows. "You left me behind." The whisper sent a shockwave of terror through my body. I spun around, scanning the room. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. Then I noticed the photograph in my hand. It had changed. The stranger, the man who had always been standing in the background, was no longer in the picture. My stomach dropped. Slowly, with trembling hands, I turned the photograph over. There, scrawled in messy, jagged handwriting, was a single word. "Look." A floorboard creaked upstairs. He was here. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the staircase. Each step felt like I was walking toward something I wouldn't come back from. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The attic door was open. A single dim light bulb flickered inside, swaying slightly as if someone had just brushed past it. I stepped forward, and that's when I saw him, standing in the attic, just beyond the old boxes and forgotten furniture. The man from the photograph. No longer a blurry figure, no longer trapped in a picture. He was here. His eyes met mine, and he smiled. I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, my breath locked in my chest. The man took a slow step forward, his smile widening. "You don't remember me," he said softly, his voice dry and cracked like old paper. I shook my head, unable to speak. He tilted his head. "But I remember you." Memories I didn't recognize slammed into me all at once. Flashes of childhood, of laughter, of someone standing just behind us in every family photo. Then, a voice. "Promise you won't forget me." My own voice, a child's voice. I stumbled back, my pulse roaring in my ears. "You promised," the man whispered. Suddenly, the attic around me changed. The walls faded, replaced by an empty, dark space stretching infinitely in all directions. The house was gone. The floor beneath me no longer felt solid. I was somewhere else. Somewhere wrong, and the man, Daniel, was no longer just a man. His face began to twist, his smile stretching unnaturally wide, his eyes hollow black voids. I was trapped, and I finally understood. Daniel had never been a stranger. He had been part of my life, my childhood, my family. But we had erased him. We had forgotten him. And now, he was making sure I never would again. I don't remember what happened next. One moment I was in the attic. The next I was waking up in my car, parked in front of my mother's house. The photograph was in my lap. I picked it up with shaking hands, terrified of what I might see. It was the same picture, my family, my sister, and me. But Daniel was gone. No longer standing in the background, no longer smiling. He had finally left the picture, or worse, he was no longer just in the picture. He was somewhere else, somewhere real. And he was waiting. Next story. It started with a house that wasn't supposed to exist. When Daniel and his wife Sophie moved into the quiet countryside town of Hollow Creek, they were looking for a fresh start. Away from the noise, the stress, the city lights that never let them sleep. Their new home was old but charming, a Victorian-style house with creaky wooden floors and ivy creeping up the stone walls. The real estate agent had hesitated before selling it to them, but Daniel assumed it was because of the house's age. What he didn't know was that no one in town remembered the house ever being built. It had always been there, waiting. The first night, Daniel heard it. A soft whisper beneath the floorboards. At first he dismissed it as old pipes settling, but the sound had a rhythm, a pattern, like someone speaking just below the surface. Sophie didn't hear it. She slept peacefully beside him, unaware. The second night the whispers grew louder, and by the third night Daniel could hear the words, "Let me out." Daniel started noticing things out of place. A chair moved slightly from where it had been. A picture frame tilted on the wall. The door to the basement, the one they never used, was unlocked when it shouldn't have been. One night, as he got up for water, he saw it, a shadow standing at the end of the hallway, not moving, not breathing, just watching. He turned on the light. The hallway was empty, but when he looked down, his bare feet were covered in dust, except for a set of footprints leading away. Sophie found the door first. "I don't remember this being here," she said one afternoon, pressing her hand against a narrow wooden door in the hallway. It had the same faded paint as the rest of the house, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't on the house's blueprints. It shouldn't exist. The moment Daniel opened it, the whispers stopped. The room inside was small, empty, except for a single chair in the middle, facing the wall. And on that wall, written in deep scratches, were 4 words, "I am still." Here, that night Daniel dreamed of dirt, of something buried beneath the house. He woke up gasping for air, his heart slamming against his ribs. Then he heard the whisper again. This time, it was coming from inside the room they had found. Sophie was still, asleep. Slowly he stepped inside, his breath visible in the freezing air. The chair remained facing the wall. And then, he saw something move beneath the floorboards. Something pushed up from underneath, warping the wood. Knocking. 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 Desperate for answers, Daniel went into town, asking about the history of the house. Most people avoided the question. One old woman finally spoke. "You should leave." "Why?" Daniel pressed. She stared at him with hollow eyes. "Because that house doesn't want you. It wants him." "Who?" The old woman sighed, gripping his wrist. "The boy." Daniel's skin went ice cold. "There was a boy who lived in that house," she continued, "a long time ago. His parents locked him in a hidden room beneath the floors." "Why?" Her lips trembled. "Because he wasn't their son." Daniel returned home, his mind spinning. Sophie was in the kitchen, staring at the floor. When he asked what was wrong, she pointed to the tiles. The floorboards were shifting. Something underneath them was moving. That night, they decided to leave. They packed a few things and headed for the door, only to find it wouldn't open. The windows, too. The house wouldn't let them go. And then, from beneath their feet, they heard it. The sound of nails scratching the wood, then a voice, "I'm coming up." The floor burst open. Dust and debris filled the air, and in the hole beneath the house, Daniel saw it, a figure crawling out. Thin, gray, Its limbs stretched unnaturally as it pulled itself free. No eyes, just deep, empty sockets, and its mouth, too wide, too sharp, smiled. Daniel grabbed Sophie's hand and ran. The whispers surrounded them, filling every corner of the house. Then, just as suddenly, silence. They turned back. The thing was gone. But the whisper wasn't. It came from behind. "Them now, you left me behind," Sophie screamed, because the voice wasn't coming from the thing. It was coming from inside Daniel's head. They never escaped the house. Or maybe they did, but not as themselves. Days later, when a neighbor finally entered, the house was silent. Daniel and Sophie were gone. But in the hallway, the door to the forgotten room was open again. Inside, 2 new chairs faced the wall, and scratched into the wood, next to the old message, were new words. "We are still here."